Morning, everybody. This is Dr. Rajesh Yadav, Secretary, Mumbai Surgical Society. Today we are on 18th series of virtual lecture series in general surgery. Today's topics are quite interesting. It is about median arcuate ligament, would be by Dr. Prashant Rao, then malrotation of gut by Dr. Sushmita Bhatnagar, and acute mesenteric ischemia by myself. Before I start the program and introduction of our chairpersons, I would request Dr. Niranjan Agarwal to say a few words and then we'll proceed with the program. Dr. Niranjan Agarwal.
So, good evening, everyone. Once again, for this Friday, this is the 20th Friday when we are conducting this series. And as Rajesh mentioned, the topic here are though quite rare in our practice, but very interesting. And one must know the nuances of these disorders to be actually called a GI surgeon, which most of us call ourselves. So, to take the deliberations ahead, Rajesh would be the chairperson, would be introducing the speakers, and Rajesh would be introducing the chairperson. They are senior people in the field. Welcome to all, and thank you for agreeing to deliberate today on our request. And thank you, Juventus, for the platform provided. Over to Rajesh for introduction of the speakers without losing much time. Speakers, please conclude your talk within 25 minutes so that 5 minutes are left for the discussion. There's some background noises which Kuldeep needs to see.
Okay.
Rajesh, you can introduce.
Yeah. Thank you, Niranjan. So today's esteemed chairpersons are Dr. Nitin Shah. Dr. Nitin Shah is a laparoscopic and general surgeon who's practicing at Amar Nursing Home at Kandivali West, Mumbai. He has many national and international papers to his credit. He's an excellent teacher. So Dr. Nitin Shah here. Our second chairperson is Dr. Jiten Chaudhary, who is consultant surgeon at Godrej Memorial Hospital. He's a director at Sigma Hospital, Mulund West, and Ruby Hospital, Banduk West. His keen interest is laparoscopic surgery. And over to Dr. Nitin and Dr. Jiten to start the program.
Okay. Hi, good evening, everyone. Our first speaker is Dr. Prashant Rao. I think Dr. Prashant doesn't need any introduction. He's a big man, and he's a director of GI surgery and at MS Global Hospital, Mumbai. Over to you, Dr. Prashant Rao.
Thank you for the introduction. Always pleasure to be part of MSS. Wonderful job is being done with keeping everybody up to date regularly. Frankly, I don't see how you guys get the enthusiasm for all this, but it's very impressive. Thank you very much. So median arcuate ligament syndrome I'm going to talk about. There was some miscommunication, and I thought I was only talking on this and not SMA syndrome as such, which I saw later in the topic. So we will stick to this for today, and we can have that some other day. So median arcuate ligament syndrome is a very rare diagnosis, and there are a lot of synonyms. A celiac artery compression syndrome. It's actually called the Dunbar syndrome, according to Dunbar, who described it in 1965. The first person to actually describe it was Harjola in 1963, but it's popularly known as the Dunbar syndrome. So this symptom triad is there associated with median arcuate ligament syndrome. It basically is a syndrome where there's compression of the celiac trunk by the median arcuate ligament as the aorta exits the thorax to go into the abdomen and become the abdominal aorta. The first branch given is a celiac trunk, and as the celiac trunk exits, there is a ligament there, an arcuate ligament, which actually sometimes is very low hanging, or the celiac artery itself can have a high exit from the aorta, and this causes sort of compression. And this leads to postprandial pain, nausea, vomiting, and weight loss triad. And this is a classical triad. And however, since we see this triad in a lot of upper abdominal, upper GI conditions, it is said that this is a rare condition, and usually the symptomatology and the diagnosis is by exclusion. If you see the blood flow of the celiac artery, it's almost 700 ml per minute out of the whole cardiac output of 5 liters per minute. So it is a major vessel, and the major vessel supplying the upper GI tract, the spleen, the liver, the stomach. And for the diagnosis, we use various kinds of imaging. Of course, one should have a high index of suspicion, especially if the patient has significant weight loss, especially in younger patients. It is said that during adolescence, what happens is that as there is a growth spurt, the arcuate ligament actually may not rise along with the diaphragm, and there it might cause an kinking of the celiac trunk. So typically what happens is you can see this ligament, and this is the celiac plexus, and during expiration, breathing in and breathing out, breathing in there is some relaxation, and during expiration, as the diaphragm becomes a little taut and goes upwards, the arcuate ligament actually goes downwards and compresses celiac plexus and the celiac axis even more. And this can be picked up on a Doppler, where you can see elevated velocities in the celiac trunk greater than 250 centimeters per second, or a velocity gradient between the aorta and the celiac. A CT MR angiography will diagnose it more accurately. Angiography or a DSA can pick it up very accurately. And in angiography, one can also see the pressure gradient, which is pre-stenotic and post-stenotic in the celiac. And this is more pronounced in the expiration, and this can be used as a tool to make an accurate diagnosis. Now, these are some of the images that you can see. What is classically seen is the celiac axis appears to have a sort of hook-shaped deformity as the median arcuate ligament compresses it. Now you can see in a lateral view, this is the stenosis which is seen, and this is the post-stenotic dilatation which is classically seen. And post-stenotic, you have higher velocity flows in the celiac trunk because of this turbulent flow which is caused by the obstruction. And frequently flows may go up to 350, 330, 500 per second, centimeters per second. Now you can see classically this is what it looks like. This is some of the CT scans of our patients. You can see on the lateral view here. Now you can see this is the aorta coming into view, and this is the celiac. You can see the hook-shaped deformity here in the celiac as is there, and this is on the classical CT scan view. This is the celiac trunk which is coming out, and you can see the sort of compression as it comes out of the aorta, and this will be what appears as a hook-shaped deformity. And if you can see in a still photograph here you can see how narrow the celiac is at its origin, and later on there is a post-stenotic dilatation, and this is the aorta, and this is where it's taking off from the aorta, and it's sort of getting compressed or depressed there by the median arcuate ligament which is coming on top of it. So treatment, one can do a PTCA or an angioplasty after an angiography. However, the problem is that if you do an angioplasty or you put a stent when the median arcuate ligament is still compressing it, it is very likely that this median arcuate ligament will fracture the stent. So it's very important that one should release the median arcuate ligament. If you are doing, you can try a balloon dilatation, but usually it doesn't work because the arcuate ligament, as I'll show you in a video later, is quite a thick structure and quite a tough structure. So that is why it is necessary to cut this arcuate ligament, even if you want to try revascularization with stenting. And yes, some patients also require this because of long-standing stenosis of the celiac trunk. It can be quite compressed at that level, and this compression can last even after you remove the compressing element or the median arcuate ligament. However, sometimes these people also have plaques inside the celiac, which you have to distinguish beforehand as a possible cause. But if a median arcuate ligament is compressing, before you do a PTCA or angioplasty, it is necessary to divide this. And laparoscopic division or robotic division and freeing of the celiac trunk is the method of choice nowadays. Classically, earlier it was done by vascular surgeons, and they used to do open surgery, as you know. To approach this part of the abdomen very close to the hiatus and above the hiatus, you require a whacking big incision in the upper abdomen, almost from the xiphisternum to the umbilicus, and because you have to retract and go back well inside. But this can be completely avoided by minimal invasive techniques, in which you just put a laparoscope and a few ports, and you do the same thing. There are two approaches. One, you can go anterior to the stomach, or you can retract the stomach using sutures to the anterior abdominal wall and go posterior to the stomach. That is what I usually prefer, but sometimes you need a combination of the two. If you are not very clear of what you are doing, you can go posteriorly and anteriorly, and you can get a good view of the celiac trunk from both sides before making a decision of what exactly you need to divide. The ports are exactly like fundoplication, where you have got one xiphisternum port, which is retracting the liver, and a telescope supraumbilically, and two ports on either side, and the bilateral mid-clavicular lines for triangulation, and if necessary, one more port for a retraction of the stomach. But usually we take sutures and retract the stomach to the anterior abdominal wall. Now, this is a short video. You can see here we have retracted the stomach upwards. This is the left gastric, which is going from the celiac trunk upwards to the stomach. This is the gastric wall. This is the crust of the diaphragm, you can see. And here are the fibers which are compressing the celiac. Now you can see these fibers you can take with either ultrasonication, or you can take them with a hook. I like to do both, and sometimes it is very convenient if you can pick them up individually, fibers with a hook. And as Dr. Udvaria had taught us even during laparoscopic cholecystectomy, it is very nice if you can hook, look, and then cook. Make sure that you are taking fiber by fiber, so you do not damage the vessel, or you do not damage anything that is unnecessary. Now this is the pancreas down below. The pancreas has been retracted and it's being pushed down. Again, this is the left gastric going up. This is the crust of the diaphragm, and the celiac artery is somewhere here. Now it is hidden because of all these ligaments, and as we clear the ligaments, you will see the celiac. This is a bit of the celiac which you can see here, but it's still hidden by all these ligaments and structures. And you can see now we are dividing all the ligaments, but the main ligament, or the median arcuate ligament, will be coming up higher up, and you can see that as we divide it. Now these are some fibers that have been divided. This is the main ligament, which is causing a compression of the, you can see these white fibers of the median arcuate ligament. So some muscular fibers will be reddish in color, and some will be white and tendinous like. And you can see here, this is the main arcuate ligament. You can lifting into this suction, and it's going across, so it goes across horizontally, and it depresses the celiac trunk as it exits the aorta. Now, as you know, the celiac itself has three branches. One is the left gastric, the hepatic, and the splenic, pancreatic or splenic. Now, sometimes the inferior phrenic branch also comes from the celiac, and this you have to be careful. But this inferior phrenic, if it is coming from the celiac, it can be divided at the higher origin, which is usually just as it exits the median arcuate ligament. Now you can see this is the main fibers of the median arcuate ligament. They are being divided by ultrasonication or a harmonic scalpel. It's a very tough ligament, but not very vascular when you cut it. And there are still some more fibers which we have to divide to free the celiac. Now what I like to do is sometimes they say that you have to also take some of the ganglionic fibers on the celiac and free the whole artery from the encumbrances which is caused by the ligament and the ganglionic fibers, and you have to release the whole artery till you see the trifurcation, till you see the vessels it bifurcating or trifurcating into the vessels, and that is what I think is a must. Now you can see the celiac artery. I have lifted up the celiac artery. This is the aorta behind, and this is the aorta, which is covered in some fascia. There's still some more fibers here which we'll take out, and some more fibers which are here of the celiac ganglion, which cover the vessel as it goes out. Now here you can see there is a small branch of the inferior phrenic which is going to the diaphragm, and this is the left gastric which is going up from the celiac axis. It's very easy to damage the celiac, so one should be extremely careful. It is a major vessel of the abdomen. Now sometimes if you are not sure there is a plaque, what we have done is intraoperatively you can do angiography. You can check before you divide the median arcuate ligament, you can check the velocity in the celiac and the hepatic, and after you divide the median arcuate ligament, you can see whether the velocity and the pressure gradient has sort of equalized or become better than it was pre-division, and this gives you some kind of a indication whether you have done a good job. Also, it gives you some indication whether there is some plaque inside the celiac or some compression from within the vessel itself. And this is important to distinguish, because otherwise you might just divide a median arcuate ligament, and if there is some compression within the celiac, the patient will also require stenting. So you need to tell this to the patient beforehand. Now you can see these fibers which are holding the celiac artery a little away from the origin, which are also being divided, and the vessel is being completely freed. Now you can see it's turning here to give the pancreatosplenic, and it will be going that side to give the hepatic, and this is the upper border of the pancreas. Normally the celiac is a very short trunk, but I think in cases where the median arcuate ligament is compressing it, sort of you get, once you divide it, you sort of seem to get more length, or maybe it's just because you are completely skeletonizing the vessel that you will see. Here are some fibers also which we take later on. You can see the last bit of fibers are being taken. So this kind of dissection, I think it's more difficult with a harmonic and easier with a hook. This is the last bit of the median arcuate ligament fibers which are being separated. And this gives you a free vessel. You can see the small inferior phrenic branch which is coming out from the celiac here. And you can see here there is a broadening now where it was highly stenotic, as you saw on the video earlier. Now you can see the bifurcation and the trifurcation here. We make sure that there are no more fibers. There's the aorta there. Now you can see this fascia is far away from the celiac trunk. But still we are bearing it to open up the aorta. And now you can see the free pulsations of the aorta, the origin of the celiac. This is the crust of the diaphragm, the inferior phrenic going off, the vessels separating here, the hepatic, the left gastric going upwards, and the pancreatico-splenic. So long-term results. If you do only a median arcuate ligament release, they say 53% of patients will have long-term asymptomatic life. If you do a median arcuate ligament release and later on a revascularization, up to 79%. However, what is shown is that almost 81% of patients after this release will have postprandial pain relief, and that is what they usually come to you for. A good indication to see whether they will respond are aged 40 to 60 years of age, weight loss greater than 10 kilos, and these are the patients who get good results in. If they are more than 60 kgs of weight loss is less, there is drug and alcohol abuse, then usually the results are poor. This is from Yu et al., treatment of median arcuate ligament syndrome, and they had done an extensive study of the cases in literature over the last few years. So it's very important to choose your patients well. Like I said, sometimes it's a diagnosis of exclusion. You make sure that that is the only thing causing the symptom, and not other things. You also discuss with the patients beforehand that it's possible that they could have internal constriction of the celiac artery itself due to a plaque or stenosis due to other reasons. Also, if the median arcuate ligament has been compressing for a long time, the artery might get deformed over a period of time, and they may also require stenting after that. So all these things have to be borne in mind. But like I said, if you stent before releasing the ligament, it's likely the stent will fracture and lead to a disaster. So usually the ligament does have to be released. Again, if the patient is not symptomatic and this is just a finding you have seen on CT scan, it may not be necessary to operate because it may not necessarily be causing any symptoms at all. It might be just developmental. So all these things have to be considered when you treat these patients. Thank you very much. I think I've stuck to my time more than enough so that we can have a discussion if required.
A very nice presentation, Dr. Prashant Rao, sir. I think there are no questions and answers.
Thank you.
Hello.
Everybody's speechless.
Can you hear, sir?
Yeah, I can hear you very well.
Sir, so you mean say after releasing the median arcuate ligament, it is advisable to stent the celiac artery, celiac trunk?
So, not always, but you may require to stent it.
And what are the chances of it getting stenosed again?
So that is what, so you have to see if the patients put on weight. Most of these patients put on weight after the surgery. If they put on adequate weight of the surgery, they may not require anything further. If the symptoms persist, then you have to tell the patient that you will repeat an angiography or do a color Doppler and see the pressure gradient and the velocity in the celiac trunk. And if you feel there is still some deficiency, then the patient may require stenting.
And then do you keep a vascular surgeon standby while you're operating such a around the aorta and this such? But is it advisable to, for you it may be not be necessary, but for others?
No, I have not kept, but I do a lot of oncosurgery and we routinely bare these vessels for lymph node clearance even in oncosurgery. So this is we do bare the celiac sometimes, we do bare the left gastric, the hepatic routinely when we are doing oncosurgery. So it is not uncommon for at least us to, for me at least, to bare these vessels. So I don't really keep a vascular surgeon on call for this. But again, I work in an institute where I can get a vascular surgeon very easily if I should require. So that advantage is also there.
Yeah, being working in a
May I
global
ask one
hospital.
question?
Yes.
Many of these patients have got some non-specific symptoms, and when you investigate them thoroughly, you find on CT there is a median arcuate, like they are also very sure that there is a suspicion. What do you do in those cases? How do you establish that the symptoms are because of the median arcuate ligament only, or is it because of something else?
So, vague symptoms, one has to be extremely careful. Like I said, there's a classic symptom triad of nausea, vomiting, postprandial pain, and weight loss. And if this triad is their classical symptom trial, then you're on more sure footing. However, if patient has upper epigastric or upper abdominal pain, and you do not find any other cause, and the median arcuate ligament is compressing, then a case can be made out for surgery for this. However, you have to discuss with the patients very clearly beforehand that this is what we have found, this is probably what is causing your symptoms. But then in such cases, it has to be a diagnosis by exclusion. You have to make sure that there is no other pathology in the upper abdomen. Gallstones, H. pylori, anything else that you can find in the upper abdomen, which could make some kind of symptoms like this. Even non-ulcer dyspepsia or dyspepsia. But if you have the classical triad and you've got a classical radiological finding, then you're on sure footing to offer them surgery.
So there is a question from Dr. Rashmi Mehta. Is angio done on the table after the release?
So I have done it on table before and after the release. Also check the pressure gradients. You can do it. It's not mandatory. It's not mandatory. If you have the facility, if you have a doubtful patient in older patients, sometimes we have done it.
Fine. And there is one question from Dr. Manmohan Kamath asking, is there any role of ICG?
I have not tried it for this. I don't know also in literature whether there is any need for ICG in this. ICG will probably show the vessels, but I don't know whether it will show whether the stenosis is gone or not. ICG I have used for gallbladder, for ureters, but I have not heard of it being used for a MALS release. But maybe I don't know.
Prashant, Prashant,
Yes.
if you
Yes,
have
sir.
a associated gallstone, so you remove or you do both the things.
Well, if patient is symptomatic for postprandial pain, then yes, I might do both, or I might, if discuss with the patient, and depending on what I think is causing, I might do just the gallbladder first and wait and watch. Also, but one can certainly discuss this with the patient. And if your radiological findings are all fitting in, then maybe you should do both together.
Okay.
Any questions?
I think somebody is not on mute.
Yeah, somebody is having a lot of.
There are some question and answers in the
Yeah,
chat.
there are two
I will
which
pick.
we have already answered. Now, Devan,
Okay.
regarding
All
role of
right.
ICT and angio. So,
Yeah,
one
yeah.
question I wanted to ask Prashant is, of course, it's a very rare thing to be diagnosed, and not many series people would have. What would be the ideal time
Yeah.
to follow up this patient? Which would you really say that they are that the symptom was because of this? You won't have immediate results. Post operative immediately it doesn't work like a magic on table. That the next day they start eating well and all that.
Correct. 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 So if the patient is symptomatic again, then certainly one should investigate and see whether patients require revascularization. Like I said, more percentage of patients remain symptom free for a longer time if they get a MALS release along with revascularization. So certainly some of them require revascularization, and one has to see if that is required if your patient is not completely relieved.
Okay.
And again, we are assuming that you have excluded all other causes of upper
All other
GI
causes.
pain, because this is a diagnosis of exclusion,
Yep.
especially if you don't have a classical triad.
Yep. Jitain, unmute yourself. Jitain, unmute yourself. Jitain and Dr. Nitin, please unmute yourself.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Prashant Rao. And
Thank you.
Dr. Nitin Shah, kindly introduce your next speaker, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, MSS. Thank you all.
Prashant. Dr. Nitin, you'll have to unmute yourself. Dr. Nitin Shah, you have muted yourself. You'll have to unmute. Jitin?
Yes.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. I thank Dr. Rajesh for my nice introduction, but I just want to clarify, I've not had any presentation, and neither am I. I'm not neither a teacher also. Anyway, Dr. Bhatnagar is a president of Association Medical Consultant. She is a leading pediatric surgeon attached to Global Hospital and Bombay Hospital and many other big institutes. Over to Dr. Bhatnagar.
Very good evening, and thank you for having me here. The MSS organizing team, I'm really, really happy to be on this platform. So can I share the screen? The topic of today for me is malrotation of the gut. So you can see the screen.
Yes, yes, we can.
Right, okay. So malrotation is a congenital anatomical anomaly that results due to abnormal rotation of the gut as it returns to the abdominal cavity during embryogenesis. And the process begins in the 5th week of gestation. Now, many of the individuals present, but there are some who do not present and they live their entire life with the malrotated bowel without symptoms, because it doesn't always present with the volvulus or internal herniation. But when it does, they are potential life-threatening complications. So before 1900, the first reports of this malrotation were based on surgical and autopsy findings. And then later in 1898, the first description of this process was published. In 1923, Dot was the first one to describe the relationship between embryological intestinal rotation and surgical treatment. And William E. Ladd was the person on whose name the surgical intervention is labeled. And this was between 1932 to 1936. He devised the Ladd's procedure, and publication was done in 1936. And this procedure still remains the cornerstone of our practice today. So why does malrotation occur? Let me just show you a very, very brief video. This is for the understanding for the postgraduates who are here with us today.
This is a brief overview of the embryological rotation of the midgut. Arterial blood to the gut tube is supplied by the abdominal aorta. The gut tube is composed of the foregut with blood supply from the celiac artery, the midgut with blood supply from the superior mesenteric artery, and the hindgut with blood supply from the inferior mesenteric artery. During the 5th week of development, the midgut starts to loop ventrally, herniating into the umbilical cord. This growth process creates much of the resulting length of the intestines. The cranial limb of this midgut extension will ultimately form the distal duodenum, jejunum, and part of the ileum. The caudal limb of this midgut extension will ultimately form the distal ileum, cecum, appendix, ascending colon, and 2/3 of the transverse colon. As the midgut lengthens, it also rotates 90 degrees counterclockwise around the axis of the combined superior mesenteric artery and umbilical cord. The cranial limb of the midgut, now on the right side of the umbilical cord, becomes highly convoluted throughout the next few weeks. The caudal limb of the midgut, now on the left side of the umbilical cord, grows a small cecal bud, ultimately becoming the cecum and appendix of the colon. During the 10th week of development, the midgut retracts back into the abdominal cavity and rotates an additional 180 degrees counterclockwise for a total 270-degree rotation of the intestines. The duodenum, jejunum, and ileum are now inside the borders of the entire colon, which is composed of an ascending part, a transverse part, a descending part, and a sigmoid part.
So I hope this clarifies how the malrotation occurs. So a malrotation does not occur on its own. There are many other conditions which occur. About 60% of the people have associated anomalies, majority of which, around 40% of these have the gastrointestinal tract anomalies. They have duodenal atresia, stenosis or web, and this can be easily missed out during the surgery because the presentations are generally the same in both the conditions. Abdominal wall defects are always there associated with a degree of malrotation because the process of herniation of the bowel and then retracting back into the abdominal cavity and rotation are all correlated. The hepatobiliary pancreatic conditions also as associated anomalies occur, such as agenesis of the gallbladder, intra and extrahepatic biliary atresia. Believe me, I have had a patient who had presented with biliary atresia, who had presented with jaundice conjugated hyperbilirubinemia, and during surgery was found to have malrotation. It's very unusual, but yes, it does occur. The pancreatic malformations such as hypoplasia, agenesis occurs, congenital diaphragmatic hernia can occur, heterotexy can occur in 70% of individuals who have malrotation, choanal atresia, hypospadias, though not as common. Now, how do these patients present? So there are various ways of describing the clinical presentation. The age is one of the very important factors wherein the clinical presentation will differ from one to another. So neonatal is the most common age of presentation, but it could present in a later age group, pediatric age group, as well as in adults. Now, it can occur without volvulus or with volvulus. Obviously, without volvulus, those without volvulus will have different clinical features than those who present with volvulus. Even those who are presenting without volvulus can present without intestinal obstruction and with intestinal obstruction. So again, the presentation will vary on the actual pathophysiology which is happening. The volvulus in malrotation can occur in an acute form, which occurs most commonly in the neonatal age group, and the chronic ones, which occurs in pediatric age group, and also in some few adult age groups. Now, there are the clinical presentation will also depend on the type of malrotation. Could be either non-rotation, which means that the entire cecum is on the left hand side, cecum appendix, the ascending colon is on the left hand side, the entire large small bowel loops are on the right hand side of the abdomen, and there has been no rotation whatsoever which has happened. Incomplete rotation is the most common type of malrotation, wherein some partial rotation has happened and somewhere the rotation has got arrested. And reverse rotation is, instead of the anti-clockwise direction, there is rotation in the clockwise direction. So which can lead to compression of the colon. That is the most common feature. Now, Stringer classified these three types of non-rotation, reverse rotation, and incomplete rotation into three different categories, meaning even sub-classified further into 1, 2A, B, C, 3A, B, C. So it's not really that important for us at the moment to dwell a little more on this single classification, but it is important to diagnose malrotation, because many a times with atypical presentations, especially the ones which are not in the acute form, they're very difficult to diagnose. So as I was mentioning, 80% of these patients present within the first month of life. Almost 100% have bilious vomiting. And these I am talking of the pediatric. In the adult, there are many other ways of presentations. And unless there is an acute volvulus, they do not present with bilious vomiting. About 82% of these neonates have midgut volvulus and require emergency laparotomy. 20% only present after the first year of age, which means in the pediatric age group, and acute presentation with volvulus is much less common. The same as I mentioned, in adults, the acute presentation with volvulus is much less common. So any patient, though we have to remember that any patient with malrotation is a high risk for volvulus. And that is the reason that as and when it is diagnosed, or as and when the child or the adult presents, it needs to be taken care of, and we cannot leave it for later, because midgut volvulus is a dire emergency with life-threatening complications. So how do we diagnose? Is clinical diagnosis enough? Can we just examine the patient, whether it is a neonate or a child or an adult, and say that, yes, this is malrotation? No, not always. We do need to investigate. So some radiological investigations, what pictures I have put up is neonatal acute intestinal obstruction with or without volvulus. So the first picture shows double bubble, which is a classical sign of malrotation. Now there are some other conditions. There are some differential diagnosis of double bubble, which is duodenal atresia, duodenal stenosis. But very important to note that malrotation is one of the most common conditions in pediatric or neonatal emergencies, and especially those who have bilious vomiting. So first and foremost, the diagnosis which comes to the mind is malrotation. So in the second X-ray, plain X-ray abdomen erect, we generally do a complete babygram to look for other anomalies as well, which includes head, neck, chest, abdomen, pelvis, and even the limbs. Here in the second picture, it shows a hugely dilated duodenum and with an acute cutoff, which is onto the right side of the abdomen. So, which means that there could be an element of volvulus here. The third picture is an ultrasound, which shows a hugely dilated stomach and the duodenum. Barium studies also can be done, but usually in an acute phase when the baby presents with the bilious vomiting and distended abdomen, barium studies are not to be done. Now, if we go back and look at this picture, what would I do? Is the diagnosis confirmed? Yes, I don't need to investigate this child or this baby any further, because this is clear cut that this is surgical abdomen. But in certain conditions, especially the chronic ones and the non-acute presentation ones, we do need to have a clearer picture as to what we are dealing with, whether we need to intervene surgically or not. And this barium meal follow through is showing a stomach which is a little dilated. Maybe it is not full, that is why we're not able to see the hugely dilated stomach, the duodenum, and the loop of the duodenum, which is not crossing onto the left side. The very clear in this picture, and even clearer in this barium meal follow through. Now this picture is also this X-ray is also a patient with malrotation. Why do I say that? Because there is no double bubble, there is no dilatation of the stomach which is seen. So this is a classical picture when there is a volvulus. In volvulus, there is no gas, it is gasless abdomen. And if you see this picture, the patient has to be on the table immediately. Immediately means absolutely immediately. Now, this is for a patient who is a little older, not a neonate, and you see this corkscrew, this kind of a picture, and this occurs in volvulus. So once you see this on a barium meal, you know that this patient needs to be operated as early as possible. Now, sometimes a contrast enema, barium or urographin enema needs to be done. And this is to confirm. Many a times we are not able to diagnose. The features are not classical either on clinical or on X-ray abdomen. And here we diagnose where is the presence of cecum. So the cecum is subhepatic, which is a diagnostic confirmation of partial rotation, which is incomplete rotation, which is a most common type of malrotation. Now, do we do ultrasound as a first investigation? No, the first investigation is an X-ray abdomen. Further than that, yes, if we need to confirm, we can do ultrasound abdomen. And most of the times nowadays we are doing an ultrasound abdomen because there is lot of other congenital anomalies, the renal, the GI, that we need to diagnose. So two most important features on ultrasound are the SMA-SMV relationship. The vein is on the right, the artery is on the left, but this relationship is reversed in cases where there is malrotation. It's not 100%, but majority of them have this. More than 75% of the patients will present with this relationship, which is changed. Also that the retromesenteric D3 segment, the third segment of the duodenum, it's supposed to be horizontal, but it will be seen as transverse plane between the superior mesenteric vessels and the aorta. When there is volvulus, we see this whirlpool sign on ultrasound, which is also now volvulus clinically will present in a neonate with hematemesis and melena. Blood in the nasogastric tube or frank blood per rectum means that the patient has volvulus and he needs to be taken up to the operating table immediately to release this volvulus. Otherwise, dire consequences are going to be, we're going to face them, and it will be a huge loss to the family. Then there is a bird beaking, the bird beak sign. This is whirlpool sign on ultrasound and the bird beak sign on ultrasound, which shows cut off in the duodenum, which is diagnostic of malrotation. CT scan may be done. We don't really do it in classical cases wherein the diagnosis occurs even on clinical examination. Here again, we check for the D3 segment, the third segment, the third duodenal segment, the relationship of SMA and SMV, the placement of the large bowel, especially the appendix, and the whirlpool sign in case of a volvulus. So this whirlpool sign here in case of volvulus is seen even on CT scan. So how do we treat? Is there any role of conservative therapy or surgical therapy is the only modality of treatment? So if we follow these principles, resuscitation and stabilization of the patient is of utmost importance, because many times they are not they don't present right in the beginning. They have persistent vomiting, whether it is bilious or non-bilious, and they tend to go into dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. But as I was mentioning earlier as well, this condition, the only modality of treatment is surgical intervention. And the principles underlying the surgical intervention is mobilization of the bowel. And if there is volvulus, then it is detorsion, division of abnormal peritoneal bands, which are Ladd's bands, which are between the large bowel and the small bowel and the duodenum and cecum. The widening of the mesenteric base. Fixation, widening of the mesenteric base actually happens after division of all the Ladd's bands, which are present even in the mesentery. Fixation of the duodenum cecum, which is not routinely practiced. Sometimes it is required, but appendicectomy is almost always done for these patients, so that in later life, the patient does not present with undiagnosed appendicitis, because the appendix is on the left-hand side after placement, after correction. Following surgical correction, the entire bowel is not placed in the normal, it is placed in the non-rotated form. So which means that in non-rotation, cecum is on the left-hand side and the small bowel is on the right-hand side. So this is a picturesque representation with volvulus. It is detorted, and then these bands, the Ladd's bands, are divided. This mesentery is widened. This is the mesentery which is widened. And then this is the cecum, ascending colon, descending colon, rectum sigmoid, and this is the small bowel here on the right hand side. So this can be done either through open surgery, which is the most common method, especially in the pediatric, because most of the pediatric patients present with volvulus, or at least in the acute form with intestinal obstruction. It could be done laparoscopically or robotically. So I would like to just highlight this one patient. He had one episode of frank blood, absolutely red frank blood per rectum. And on the phone, he was diagnosed by me as malrotation, looking at all the clinical features. and malrotation with volvulus, because bleeding per rectum occurs in malrotation with volvulus. X-ray picture was immediately taken, gasless abdomen. The patient was literally wheeled in, even without the admission papers being done, wheeled in the operating table. This was the color of the bowel, almost dusky. If we would have been delayed by 1 hour also, the whole bowel would have necrosed, and we would have had the loss of the entire bowel, leading to you know, if we don't have even 30-35 centimeters of bowel in a newborn, then chances of survival are impossible. And then after detorting, the color of the bowel returned to normal. So now when we talk of approaches, there have been various studies done in pediatric as well as in adult population, depending, comparing the laparoscopic versus open procedures. And it has, all the studies have led to one conclusion, that when the patients present in an emergency, when they present with volvulus, then the best way to operate, the best approach is the open approach. And so minimally invasive approaches are being increasingly used. No evidence supports laparoscopic superiority over open LADS procedure, and open surgery was associated with shorter operating times and less clinic visits further on. So laparotomy remains the favored procedure for patients presenting with volvulus. This was the conclusion. Now we do have some unusual situations. We have something called duodenal volvulus, which is very uncommon, but it happens in chronic conditions where the duodenum is so dilated that even the retroperitoneally it can go into the state of torsion, causing volvulus, desloughing, necrosis, perforation, rupture, and it is very difficult actually to salvage such a patient who has not been diagnosed correctly. And then the adult presentation. So there have been several studies about the adult presentation. Same laparoscopic as well as open procedures, and there are many studies. I have just picked up some few. This particular study has been from 1984 to 2003, where 21 adults only were included. When we compare this with the pediatric neonatal population, they are almost 1/10, not even 1/10, I would say 1/100th of the pediatric or the adult population who pediatric or the neonatal population who will develop malrotation, or who have not been diagnosed malrotation, maybe because they did not present at all, or maybe they were not really investigated in detail for them to be diagnosed. So a little bit of history about the adult laparoscopic or open versus laparoscopic LADS procedure. The first report of laparoscopic procedure was in 1995 in Netherlands, and there in 1996 in the US. And since then, many studies have been reported. As I was mentioning, it has been found to be safe and effective and a feasible method modality of treatment for malrotation, even in the presence of volvulus in adults. Now, in neonatal population, it becomes extremely difficult. There are problems with recurrence, which could be said as a complication, but yes, it has been reported in an adult population. So there have been the case reports and literature review of adult presentation of medial volvulus secondary to intestinal malrotation, adult malrotation, a case report. So majority of them which I have found are case reports rather than studies, rather than case series. So when we talk of long-term outcomes, there are a few problems. One is because of the condition, the disease process itself. which means that if the patient had volvulus and whether he had a loss of bowel, then short bowel syndrome or adhesions. And second is because of the surgery that he has undergone, either open or laparoscopic. So there have been two major studies for long-term complications, and about 50% of them do not have complications, but it is a huge group where 50% have complications some way or the other: chronic abdominal pain, feeding difficulties, recurrent loose motions, diarrhea, GERD. All of these things can happen, and that is why a follow-up, long-term follow-up is required in such patients. So this is the same study which I was mentioning about. Up to 2008, this study was done for mean follow-up was for 5 years. Majority of them had undergone emergency procedure. Volvulus was there in 31%. And 2 had required bowel resection. So adhesive small bowel obstruction, incisional hernia, perforated viscus, recurrent volvulus, these are the complications related to surgery for these patients. Thank you very much for being here and for patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Sushmita. Jiten?
Yes. Yes, madam, it was a nice presentation.
Thank you.
And there are no questions in the, I think your presentation was very, very exhaustive and very good presentation. So there are no questions. But I want to ask, madam, the question like, what is the incision you choose for these babies?
So if there is, so I have done this procedure through 2 different incisions. One is upper abdominal transverse incision, not midline, upper abdominal transverse incision, and umbilical, para-umbilical incision.
Okay. And is there any, where do you put the drains, if at all?
No drains are put ever.
Oh. Okay.
Because we don't generally perforate the viscus or nothing. Now, if there is already a perforated peritonitis which has happened, then the whole entire procedure is different. Then it will be treated as a perforation of the intestine and not really as a malrotation, because at that point of time it becomes very difficult to do the entire procedure completely. Then it is completely different.
But there must be some times when you will be doing some resection kind of thing, resection anastomosis.
Yes, resection is needed if there is a delay in diagnosis and treatment. Resection per se, most of the times when there is volvulus, the entire midgut is lost.
Okay.
And in those cases, resection anastomosis, if we are lucky, we get about 30-35 centimeters, 40 centimeters sometimes, if we are lucky. And this has happened in very few patients. Majority of them have a loss of the midgut, where there is no question of doing any further, where we derotate, and then we have to, if we feel, then we can go in for a second look surgery. But otherwise, if there is no improvement in the change or color of the bowel on table, then there is really no point of doing any anastomosis. So anastomosis is done, yes, but in a very small percentage of patients. So I've had patients with short bowel syndrome whom we have managed. Those patients have grown well, but it is really a task, like, to manage these small babies. There was one girl had 1.8 kilos of birth weight where she was operated. She had short gut syndrome because of malrotation with volvulus. She had only about 30 centimeters of the bowel with the IC junction, which was good, because without IC junction, that is not possible. And following following that, at the age of 2 years, she was just about 4 kilos, which is like really tiny. 4 kilos could be a newborn, which she was at 2 years. But with consistent and persistent efforts in feeding, we did manage to make her good. Now she is about 4 years old and she is about 10 kilos, which is very good as compared to what she was to begin with.
Madam, I one more question, please. This thing, have you, is there a role of TPN in these cases?
Yes, for short bowel syndrome, I have not really touched upon because it would not have been, meaning short bowel itself is a topic, huge topic. TPN I have used, yes. In neonates, we prepare our own TPN because it's not available. Pre-prepared formulas are not available in the market.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we move on to the last speaker? I'd like to introduce him. He is Dr. Rajesh Yadav, and he is the secretary of the Mumbai Surgical Society. He, along with Dr. Niranjan Agrawal, has been organizing this series, lecture series on every Friday. Really a Hercules task. Hats off to you people. And now he is also a professor and consultant PG teacher at Bombay Hospital, and he's a professor of surgery at JJ Hospital.
Thank you, Jiten. At the onset, I would like to thank Mumbai Surgical Society on my behalf, as well as Niranjan. It is his baby, I would say, that we are being able to do these lectures because of his unrelentless efforts all the time. Thank you, Niranjan, again. And my topic today is acute mesenteric ischemia. If we go by the definition of what is acute mesenteric ischemia, is characterized as a group of disease wherein interruption of the blood supply to various portions of small intestines as well as large intestine, leading to ischemia and inflammatory changes. Now, this definition means a lot of things. It's basically simple words is that there is a ischemia of the small intestine, that is your jejunum, ileum, and the colon. Now, here specifically, we know the mesentery is there for the jejunum, ileum, as well as the entire colon. But more or less, it is the proximal colon and the jejunum and ileum which get ischemic. We have rarely interacted with ischemia of the colon distal to the proximal colon, that is descending, descending as well as the part of transverse and the sigmoid colon. The reasons we'll describe in the subsequent slides. Now, it's a frequently missed emergency. Why am I saying this? Why is it called a frequently missed emergency? Now, I'll tell you, you require a very, very high degree of suspicion, especially to diagnose a mesenteric artery ischemia or mesenteric venous ischemia, rather acute mesenteric ischemia. What do you mean by high degree of suspicion? Because the percentage is only about 0.02 to 1%. That is probably 1 in 1,000 cases, or less than 1%. It's probably 0.1%. So 1 in 1,000 cases of acute emergencies which are presenting in casualties would be having an acute mesenteric ischemia. And since if you don't diagnose it in first 6 to 24 hours max, the mortality is in high range of about 60 to 80 or probably almost 100% at times. So that's why it is so damn important to diagnose these as early as possible. And that's why you require a very high degree of suspicion. Now, regarding the clinical presentations, it's a severe pain in abdomen, and the pain in abdomen is really out of proportion to the findings. It's almost 95% of the time the abdomen appears as if it is soft, but the pain is really out of proportions. At time and again, people have even referred these patients as if they are malingering, because when you examine these patients, proportionately the clinical findings don't really match, and that is what causes the delay in diagnosis. Now, to assist few of the symptoms which come along with this type of pain is rapid onset of periumbilical severe nausea and vomiting, and forceful and urgent bowel evacuation. These are probably the symptoms which go along with severe abdominal pain. Now, we know that the reasons for severe abdominal pain, apart from our colics, which are renal colics and gallbladder colics or the biliary colics, we have pancreatitis, we have dissecting aneurysm of the aortas and perforations. But mind you, the pain in mesenteric ischemia far exceeds the pain what is there here. We know the colics, patient toss in the bed. In peritonitis, we know the patients lie down still. In here, the patient neither tosses in bed, neither still is in severe pain, and which you can't really miss. So that's why a strong degree of suspicious is what is needed. So that's why the demography here, if we go, the incidence is very low, and the surgical admission, that is 1 in 1,000, which I have already talked about. Now, there is a thing that why only superior mesenteric artery which gets involved, rather which gets thrombosed or embolosed or gets into spasm. Now, there are certain theories which have been put forward that superior mesenteric artery involvement is one. It is the largest caliber vessel. Obviously, why largest we know because it supplies right from the inferior pancreaticoduodenal artery to the first jejunal branch, the ileal branches, the ileal colic, the right and the middle colic. So it has a wide area to cover. So obviously the caliber has to be big. Secondly, it has an angle, 45-degree angle of origin, which is very clearly shown here in the CT picture. Now, what happens because of this 45-degree angle of origin, if you see as compared to that, the celiac artery, the renal arteries are at definitely 90-degree angles. So the turbulence which occurs at the superior mesenteric artery because of the 45-degree angle is very, very much as compared to what turbulence occurs in the other arteries which origin from the aorta. And this turbulence leads to damage of the intima, and which itself leads to early atherosclerotic changes, or probably leads to atheroma formation, and later which in a diabetic or in a patient with high cholesterol, these atheromas and injury to the intima lead to atherosclerotic changes. Now, what are the type of occlusions which we come across? Now, there are, of course, as I initially mentioned, when you mean by mesenteric ischemia, it is obviously there would be occlusion to the artery and there would be occlusion to the venous. That is the superior mesenteric artery and the superior mesenteric vein. As I already pointed out, that inferior mesenteric artery and venous occlusions are a rarity. Not that I have seen, even the literature has given very few times that this has occurred, but more or less whenever it's an acute mesenteric ischemia, it is the superior mesenteric artery. Now, the arterial occlusion, emboli compromises about 50% of it, thrombosis is around 30%, and there is non-occlusive phenomena. What is non-occlusive? Non-occlusive, in simple words, means spasms of the vessels supplying the small intestines and the large intestine, especially the spasms in the smaller vessels. And of course, venous occlusion, we are aware that it leads to venous thrombosis, and that compromise about 5 to 10% of the whole gambit. Now, what are the causes which leads to mesenteric ischemia, especially embolism? Now, where these embolics arise from? Now, obviously, it arises from the heart. The reasons out here is there can be a mural thrombus, left atrial myxoma, prosthetic valves, bacterial endocarditis, even iatrogenic artery. So these are the reasons why embolus can be released, and that compromises about 50%. Second, as I talked about, thrombosis is secondary to atherosclerotic changes. Now, we all know why do atherosclerosis occurs. Of course, in diabetic people with high cholesterol, fat people. So these are the few reasons which leads to early atherosclerotic changes. Then in non-occlusive causes, what do you mean by non-occlusive mesenteric ischemia? This is commonly seen, especially in an hospitalized patient. In an hospitalized patient in sepsis due to various reasons, patient in some type of cardiogenic shock due to various reasons, or for that matter, patients which have lost a lot of blood also, that is hemorrhagic shock. Apart from that, drugs like leads to vasospasm of the vessels in the small bowel, and which leads to ischemia itself. Okay, so these are the causes which leads to non-occlusive mesenteric ischemia. Now, regarding mesenteric vein thrombosis, we are all aware there are various factors which are inherited hypercoagulable states like factor 5, protein CS, Leiden mutations, of course, antithrombin 3 deficiencies, and acquired hypercoagulable states like malignancy, oral contraceptions, portal hypertensions, intra-abdominal sepsis, example, acute pancreatitis, post-operative states, example, abdominal surgeries. So these are the causes which leads to mesenteric ischemia. Now, embolus, where do the embolus get lodged in? Here in the figure, it can easily see it's 15% of the time at aortic ostium, 40% is around at the middle colic artery, and 45% of time the distal branches. Similarly, thrombosis, if you see that ostium, it is around 60 to 80%. So if you go to see if there is embolism, the chances of the bowel getting gangrene completely is as less as compared to when it is thrombosis, because the ostium is spared in embolism in quite a few number of cases as compared to thrombosis, where it is almost 60 to 80%. So most of the bowel would get gangrene. And these are the ones, if you don't pick up early, these are the one which will be not really salvageable. And then, of course, at around middle colic artery, there are 15%, and the distal branches, it is around about 5%. Now, what is the investigations of choice? Now, very, very important here, when the patient comes to our casualty with severe pain, which is out of proportion, you cannot afford to waste time doing routine investigations like ultrasonography or probably an X-ray abdomen, or for that matter, even blood investigations. Since I said that it involves a high degree of suspicion, you need to shift these patients for CT angiography, which is a gold standard investigation. Now you would say, why? It's 1 in 1,000 probably a patient which is going to come, and where you are subjecting these patients, even subjecting them to a routine investigations like X-ray or USG. As I earlier pointed out, if you miss this diagnosis in the early phases, the mortality is around about 60 to 80%. So that's pretty high a mortality. Now, apart from CT angiography, will also tell you in other cases of acute emergencies, like even pancreatitis, dissecting aneurysm of the aorta, even for that perforation. So you're not going to miss on the other causes for acute abdominal pain. Probably gallbladder colic you might miss, because the consistency of the bile and the CBD stones are more or less the same, but other things would be picked up. The only thing you have to be aware that when you're doing CT angiography, you have to avoid giving oral contrast at that particular time, because that thing can mask your your pictures. So here are some CT pictures which are showing superior mesenteric artery occlusion. Here on A, there is a good superior mesenteric artery occlusion due to an embolus. On B, there is a superior mesenteric vein which is getting obliterated. Here, there is a good picture which is depicting the superior mesenteric artery which has been occluded by an embolus. Here, again, CT scan showing wall edema in the small bowel. Now, again, let me tell you this. By the time if this comes up, wall edema, the time lost is pretty high. So in this particular patient, the chances of bowel gangrene are almost 50% and more. So then these types of patients subjecting for any type of intervention is not worth it. You probably explore these patients as early as possible. These are few other CT pictures which are there. Now regarding X-ray, as I just put out for academic purpose, but these are probably the late signs, showing dilated bowel loops, then the thumbprinting impressions on X-rays, and edema into the bowel wall. This probably occurs seen especially when the gangrene has already set in, and where obviously you have to do something called as salvageable surgery. You cannot prevent the ongoing gangrene from occurring. So obviously these are important investigations, but this won't be the first line of investigation. Now regarding Doppler, yes, it is a good investigation, can pick up stenosis and maybe obstruction, but the only reason is because one, it is operator dependent, two, it's done in emergency, three, lot of bowel gas, which makes it difficult to visualize these vessels. So that's why it may not be a gold standard, but yes, facilities where CT scans are not available, you can do ultrasonography. Now, regarding laboratory investigations, but there are no pinpoint markers which would say that this laboratory investigation will tell you that it is acute mesenteric ischemia. But broadly, we can do a count, WBC count, elevated LDH, CPK, even for that matter, lactates, elevated potassium, acidosis, metabolic acidosis, elevated arterial venous lactate increase might give a fair idea of any necrosis which is occurring in the small bowel. But again, let me tell you, this won't be at an early picture, but yes, these are few things which can assist you in diagnosis. Now, once you have established that it is a superior mesenteric artery ischemia or a superior mesenteric vein thrombosis, we know what the general management is fluid resuscitation, correction of the acid bed challenge after seeing the ABGs, correcting of the electrolyte balance, nasogastric decompression, broad spectrum antibiotics, and of course, heparin should be started IV unfractionized as early as possible to prevent further loss and further damage due to maybe thrombosis or embolus. Now, regarding the management, so if you are able to be lucky enough to pick up early on CT, whether it is an embolus or a thrombosis in the superior mesenteric artery, you can shift this patient as early as possible to a OR or to a cath lab where you can do any of these procedures. Now, in a cath lab, if it is a thrombosis, you can try putting in a catheter through the brachial artery and try and put in a stent across and try to re-establish the circulation. If not feasible, then probably rush them to an OR, and with your cardiothoracic help and of course anesthetic, cardiothoracic and your help, you might do any of these procedures like bypass grafting, maybe antegrade, retrograde. Antegrade mean to say you can take a graft from the inferior mesenteric artery and transpose it across the superior mesenteric artery, or from the lower down descending aorta, or you can re-implantation of superior mesenteric artery. Easily written than done. Of course, it's a difficult procedures, but yes, with a good fair experience with a cardiothoracic surgeon, this can be achieved. And regarding embolism, in those cases, you need to have a balloon catheter embolectomy. At times, we have even done vein patch. Now, if you ask in my experience of last 25 years, how many patients who have detected that early, I would say probably 2. But as I already told you, the incidence is 1 in 1,000. So for my lifetime, I won't have that big experience. But we could salvage 2 patients because of early scanning, that is the CT scan, which was done. Now, this is a picture, this is more dismal type of picture, what we call as a damage control surgery. Now, when this comes into play, now damage control surgeries are really done when you have missed the diagnosis by more than 24 hours. Now, when the diagnosis is missed, where the gangrene has already set in, then you can't really do much. Now, in this patients, other than doing a good laparotomy and resecting the bowel which is gangrenous, and trying to do a stoma, because I would not dare to do any anastomosis, especially with patient with acute mesenteric ischemia. Reason being, there can be second episode which can lead to further gangrene, and there are catastrophic outcomes can be. So it's better to have a stoma, and if at all you are daring to do an anastomosis, then you be prepared for a second look surgery after 48 hours. Now, regarding mesenteric venous thrombosis, of course, we are all aware, not all mesenteric venous thrombosis patients would develop gangrene of the bowel. It is probably 5 to 10% of time. So maybe 1 in 10 or probably even less than those patients of mesenteric venous thrombosis would require surgical interventions. But yes, you require a high degree of suspicion so that you can start on anticoagulant therapy as early as possible. And can be able to reverse the factors which are leading to hypercoagulability. So when you are managing mesenteric venous thrombosis, surgical intervention may not be that a primary part, but starting on anticoagulant therapy and working up on hypercoagulability will lead to recanalizations of these vessels at a later date at a faster as compared to non-recanalization, which will lead to portal cavernoma formations later. So even in mesenteric venous thrombosis, if you pick them early and start on anticoagulant early, the chances of recanalizations are pretty high. As I said, patient getting into gangrene are pretty less. So more or less this thing. Now regarding non-occlusive type of mesenteric venous ischemia, where I've already stressed upon, you have to correct the underlying conditions, especially if the patient is in sepsis, you need to correct those sepsis part. If it is in a cardiogenic shock, if the patient, that needs to be taken care of, because unless you take care of the primary condition, it would be difficult to improve the blood flow to the gut. Of course, optimizing fluid status, improving cardiac output, and eliminating vasopressors, especially alpha blockers. At times, people have tried with catheter-directed intraarterial infusion of vasodilator, that is pepaverin, and just observe for if any peritoneal signs develop. If they develop, obviously, you need to explore these patients. Now, what are the guidelines by World Society of Emergency Surgery? The acute mesenteric ischemia is a true surgical emergency. First and foremost, I want to reiterate that important evidence is high index of suspicion and on the combination of history of abrupt onset of abdominal pain, acidosis, and organ failure. This clinical scenario should prompt imaging CTA in order to establish the diagnosis. So this is what is level 1A evidence, which is there, that is early diagnosis and picking up the high degree of suspicion. Again, in parallel with rapid resuscitation and after careful assessment of the CT angiography, the patient should be explored to assess the bowel viability, re-establish vascular flow, and resect non-viable bowel. Now, this statement comes especially when there are overt signs of peritonitis. What do you mean by overt signs of peritonitis? Here, as I earlier said, that earlier there would be no clinical signs for first 24 hours, there would be only pain. And when the clinical signs clearly start coming in, that is your abdominal tenderness, guarding, rigidity, rebound, that is the time when the bowel is going to be revitalized or it would be difficult to revitalize. So these are the times where you need to go ahead and do an exploratory laparotomy. I would call it as a damage control surgery because here you're not really revascularizing anything. You're probably resecting the bowel, which is gangrenous. You have no choice. Don't attempt any reanastomosing at the same go. Probably do a stoma. Keep these patients on total parental nutrition for few days, or start early feed since there is a stoma, if there is a small amount of bowel, even if it is left, depending upon how much bowel you have removed. So, you can try, of course, your gut, you can try parenteral nutrition and go after 6 to 8 weeks to do the reanastomosis. Our experience of about 23 to 24 patients where we have primarily done stomas in all these patients. And then after 6 weeks to 12 weeks, we have gone inside and been the reanastomosis. Of course, few people have developed short bowel syndrome, but more or less, more patients have tolerated well. Some people had to be kept on total parenteral nutrition for a few days, but more or less people are doing well. Now, these are the other guidelines which are said is planned reassessment of bowel with further resection or anastomosis and stoma as needed is integral. Close cooperation with acute care surgeon, the radiologist, anesthetist, and vascular surgeon is essential. Conventional plain X-ray films have limited diagnostic value, which I have already reiterated, and the level of evidence is 1B. Only thing when there is a perforation, you might be able to pick up on conventional X-rays. The level of 1B evidence that blood reports helps you, but there is level 1A evidence that computed tomography, angiography definitely helps. There is again level 1B evidence that non-occlusive mesenteric ischemia should be suspected in critically ill patient, especially when there is multi-organ failure and there is level 1B evidence. When the diagnosis of AMI is made, fluid resuscitation should be started as early as possible. Again, broad spectrum antibiotics should be started as early as possible. Prompt laparotomy should be done for patients with overt peritonitis. That is a level 1A evidence. So if you are suspecting peritonitis, if there are signs of peritonitis, exploration is a must at the earliest. To do endovascular revascularization, level of evidence is 1C. Damage control surgery, of course, the level of evidence is 1A. And mesenteric venous thrombosis, continuous unfractionated heparin usage, the level of evidence is 1B. So when you are suspecting non-obstructive mesenteric ischemia, correcting of underlying cause, which we have already reiterated, and the finding of massive gun recurrences requires careful assessment of patient. So this point is very, very important, especially if you see there is gangrene of the bowel, which is involving right from the jejunum, right up to the proximal, that is your middle colic artery. That means first half of your colon is going to go. It's really worth taking an effort and talking to the relative about the quality of life, whether they are going to afford that thing, because this patient is not going to go on oral feeds anytime in his life because there is no jejunum left. So obviously he will be on total parenteral nutrition. Secondly, these patients are old, they have a lot of comorbid conditions. So really whether we should, try and do anything much or should just leave the thing without even resecting that particular bowel. So that's what the level of evidence says. Thank you all for your patient hearing. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yadav. It was really a very, very nice presentation and very important diagnosis to be made. And we have to act very, very promptly to diagnose such patients. We should have a very high level of suspicion. Very well said, very well demonstrated. And you have presented your talk with all the recommendations also. It was a really a very, very nice talk.
Thank you.
Neetu, I would like to ask you a question. Rajesh, what is the role of thrombolysis in these patients?
What is the role of thrombolysis?
Yeah.
Thrombolysis can be done, especially the issue with thrombolysis is if you are going to put in a thrombolysis catheter and try to do on table, the retrieval of thrombus becomes an issue. There are suction aspirators which are there, but they get dislodged and causes further down in the small bowel. So there is evidence which says that people have tried, but with not great results.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a question by Dr. Manmohan Kamath, like type of stoma, whether it is double barrel or Hartmann's. Now, Manmohan, the problem here is when we have resected most of the jejunum or ileum, at times it is so difficult to get even the small part of the jejunum out as a stoma because it's a very small jejunum left. So double barrel is out. So whatever comes out, we try to get it out. So at times we have seen only 10 centimeter of jejunum or 12 centimeter or maybe 15 centimeter. We get that thing as a stoma out, and the other part as an as a colon out, which will act as a mucus fistula. Regarding zip laparotomy, any experience? No, my personal experiences are not there. But I had, as I said, we had a series. We have also presented a paper on it. We had cases till now, around 31 cases. Out of those 31 cases of ischemia which we had operated, 23 were mesenteric venous ischemia. Now, you would say that this is quite a bit number as compared to arterial ischemias. Of course, these all mesenteric venous ischemia, the number of patients which we must have seen is more than 1,000, but only 23 probably required explorations. So that was only after 7-8 days, because mesenteric venous blockage and leading to ischemia and gangrene takes some time as compared to arterial ones. So they happened on 10th day, 8th day. So here we did a stoma and reverted back. So there was no reasons for second look surgery. The arterial ones which we saw two were so extensive, they were just not compatible with life. So we couldn't do much in those. We spoke to the relatives and told them, look, even if he resect this, he is not going to survive, which was acute arterial ischemia. Of course, one was post procedure for mesenteric artery aneurysm, and rest all the cases were involving the small segments. So there we did a resection, anastomosis. So second look surgery was there only in 2 patients, where, as I said, where we did a revascularization procedure, where we had picked up the arterial gangrene at an earlier date. So there we did a re-exploration, but zip we had not put. Yeah, thank you.
During COVID, we have seen increase in the cases of mesenteric ischemia. These ischemic cases belong to the arterial type or the venous type?
In the COVID times, which we saw, we had 7 patients of mesenteric ischemia. Now, to be very frank, only 1 patient out of this had COVID earlier. And 1 patient was diagnosed COVID when we had gone for second look type. So most of these patients were non-COVID at that time. Though we had a number which were more. This all out of this 7, only 1 was arterial, 6 were venous ischemias during this COVID time. But I cannot vouch and say that they were due to COVID. Sorry.
Okay, okay, sir. One more question. Like these patients are put on heparin.
Yeah.
Initially. So if later on we decide to operate on these patients, is there any antidote which is used to neutralize the heparin, or we can go ahead like that only?
Of course, there is no antidote for heparin. So what we can do, most of these are on therapeutic dosage, but most of them will ended up in emergency only. So we have operated with heparin, so that's not a problem. If you have time, you might not take a dose a day prior, or maybe 6 hours, 8 hours prior, but we'll end up in emergency. But you can operate on heparin when they are on heparin.
Any role of FFP?
Yes, you can give FFP, but FFP, mind you, it will help only if fresh frozen plasma, if your PT INR is grossly deranged, but otherwise, no.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Dr. Shah, any comments at the end? Nitin bhai? Is he around? I think that we should call it a day. So much insights into such rare conditions that only speaks about the experience of the speaker. Thank you, all of you, for such an excellent deliberation today and sharing your knowledges with us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.